All right. Hello, I'm Robert Evans. For this assignment, I have chosen to analyze the poem Daddy by author Sylvia Plath. Backstory on Sylvia was that she was fairly messed up as a child and in the brain in general. She did wind up taking her life in her 30s. And the poem that was written about her father, called Daddy, very descriptive title, was written as almost a FU letter to her father. It is a 17 stanza poem that begins even by talking about the oppressive natures of the household that she lived in while her father was alive. Now, keep in mind that Sylvia Plath's father did die of a diabetic disorder that turned into gangrene at her age of 10. A very, very young age for someone to hold such repressed memories of a man, of anybody. So that first stanza is talking about the pressure that she felt living under the oppressive thumb, per se, of her father. And then moving into the second stanza, it's talking about her father's death. It's talking about the gruesome manner in which he passed away. She spared no expense on explaining the detail in a very, for lack of a better word, poetic way. She talks about him being a statue and his literal gray foot because of the gangrene that had happened from his diabetic sore. So just breaking it down into how she talked about her father outside of the oppressions, the actual hatred that was there. You have as an author many ways to describe a person, whether it be in a pleasant manner or you want them to be remembered for the good things despite the bad. However, her father, because of the views that were not shared between the two of them, she painted him in a very negative, derogatory light. Moving on to the third stanza, the juicy bits. It's talking about her wish for redemption, as if her name was inherently tied to her father's, for the things that he may or may not have done, as well as the actions he may or may not have committed. She was wanting redemption. She was wanting to have something to come back from, or a legacy to leave when she was gone. She wanted to get away from him in every sense possible. In the fourth stanza, she's talking about her father's life in Germany. Her father was an immigrant from Germany during World War II when the Holocaust had just begun. There is no documented or researched affiliation between Sylvia's father and the Nazi party of the time. So it can be insinuated that perhaps Father Plath was indeed a part of the Nazi party, and that is why she has decided to write this almost revenge letter about her father many, many years after his death. We will never know what happened to cause her to write this. However, I think it's fairly apparent that, well, Daddy might have been not such a great father, not such a great human in general. So she might be separating herself from this entity that is her father, or a component in her life that caused her to be, essentially. In the fifth line, or the fifth stanza rather, there was nothing to relate. She talked about how she was never able to speak to him, and there was no point of validity that he gave her to make her feel as though she was a part of something, a part of his life, or anything greater than what was going on under their roof and their household. Thus feeding into this oppressed, very depressed human being. Following into the 6th stanza, it's stating the same thing. It's basically a cat had her tongue. She couldn't speak. It wasn't that she didn't want to, or that she didn't have things to get out. It's the actual fact of she wasn't allowed to. Anything that she thought, because of the times that she was being raised into, times were becoming a lot more liberal and accepting of different people and lifestyles. Granted, it was still in the very early conception and stage of acceptance. However, being that she was born and raised in America, she had that Americanized version of what the world was like, of not having these giant killing camps, essentially, and not sharing that belief with her father, perhaps, led to this vocal oppression where she was not able to speak of how she was feeling, what was going on in her mind, and her feelings and beliefs as to what was going on in that time. Moving into the 7th stanza, she was treated just about as good as, how she put it, a Jewish person at the time in Germany. She was walked on and was not valued as a human, as his daughter. She was just a being living in his house and eating his food. She wasn't somebody that, from the looks of it, that he loved as much as he would say maybe his home country, or even perhaps Hitler and the Nazi party of the time. Moving forward into the 8th stanza, she's talking about running from this part in her life. She wants to get away, nothing more than to become her own being and to become her own person. At the age of 10, these were her feelings. She wanted to get away from this family that didn't accept anybody, as well as their own daughter, who had her own way of thinking, who had her own mind and thought processes, and she wanted nothing more than to get away, if not more than her father's death. Because at the point where they were at, I would venture to say that perhaps Emily didn't necessarily think of her father as her father. Sylvia was an orphan of sorts, due to the fact that she couldn't talk to her dad. There was nothing to be done. Moving to the 9th stanza, she talks about the very fear of living in the household, of being around her father, or saying or doing the wrong thing out of fear of what her father would think of her and would do in backlash to these things that she felt or she thought. She wanted nothing more than to leave. She was afraid of the man that called himself her father. Looking at the 10th stanza, she's talking about how her father had the ability, because of how beautiful and Aryan, blonde hair, blue-eyed, good stature, how he had the ability to get whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, regardless of the cost or the severity of whatever it may be, whether it be his way of doing things or physical items that he demanded and he got because of how he looked. And she did not agree with this. She felt that everybody should have the same everything, essentially. So venturing to say that she wanted equality across the board for everybody was possibly perhaps what the main issue was with her father, being that he didn't necessarily believe these same things. He didn't have the same thought processes when it came to equality and people being on the same page and getting the bare necessities of life that every human being needs and deserves. Moving into the 11th stanza, she's talking about how her father, the only picture she had of her father was him standing in front of a Harvard blackboard, because that is where her father was educated. And he looks like a very prominent, educated man who looked nice, who fit the mold of what an upper class citizen should look like. Despite the times, Harvard, Yale, those schools were still expensive. It showed your place in society to have these luxuries of going to school and becoming educated. I mean, at the time, being educated was, for lack of a better term, a white people thing. We didn't allow people of color to go to higher education and educate themselves. And she insinuates that, yes, he might be educated, but that's what made him evil. That ability to become smarter than your enemy, essentially, was what led to these evil deeds and acts, and the ability to hate with reason, with an actual purpose, because of the things that you were taught when you went to school. And likewise, I don't agree with that. Sylvia was somebody, as a female author of the time, somebody who was already pushing boundaries and breaking the mold of what her father had set for her, making it so that she was pushing the envelope for everyone. Speaking out against your father in any means would have been shunned and looked down upon as you're an awful human being, and thus making your father look bad. And that right there was pushing the boundaries of everything her father had already done. When looking at the 13th stanza, it talks about her father's death again. However, this time, it's relating it to herself. It's saying that a part of her died and was buried with her father when he passed away and when he was interned into the ground. That a part of her was taken with him, but it didn't stop there. She was hoping and wishing that a part of her was all of her. She was hoping that all of her would die with her father so that she wouldn't have to live with the consequences that came with carrying the family name. She was hoping that she would be able to escape through death these terrible things that her father may have done and the oppressions that he may have helped cause and perpetuate, essentially. She was hoping that it would all end when he was gone. Moving forward into the 14th stanza, it's talking about the image that she, in her mind, had made of her father. It was talking about how, regardless of how he looked physically, the image that was in her mind was that of nothing more than somebody who was very Hitlerian, who was associated with that Nazi party and forced this oppression onto these millions of people who had no choice in the matter. No matter what her father would have done at that point, it would have still led to her having this misconstrued vision or idea of what her father was. Being you're 10 years old, you have this not so concrete, solidified way of thinking because you're still learning. However, she had already solidified at a very young age what her father was, and thus perpetuated this into every other man, essentially, that she came into contact with. She put two and two together, essentially, one being her father, one being other men, and meshed them into one, automatically assuming that no matter what, every man will have faults. I don't know, perhaps if she was thinking all men will have the same faults as her father, being oppressive and mean and degrading, or if she just meant that all men are bad. We may never know. Moving into the 15th stanza, it's talking about how she is basically trying to push her father out of her memory, this man that helped create her. She's trying to push this memory out of her mind and forget about him. She wants to do nothing more than move on now that he's gone. And up until this point, being the late 70s, early 80s, she's trying to push this idea of what her father was away and out of her mind so that she might have a chance at forgetting the bad things he'd done, the way he had treated her, and the things that he had done to the masses if he were associated with any negative parties of the time. All she wanted was to forget, and maybe all of her problems at that point would go away. Looking at the 16th and 17th stanzas, they tie in together, and I thought that was very powerful. It gives a very lengthy break between 16 and 17, where it's talking about how one man had come in and essentially, pause, ruined her. And you feel the suspense in this writing that she may have felt for her whole life. This power that she has of separating a sentence. No period, no comma, semicolon, just a break. You feel that suspense and you feel what she was feeling, how you might tiptoe and still do the wrong thing. And I felt it very powerful, saying that her father was essentially a vampire who was sucking the life out of her and turning her into this shell of nothing. She was nothing more than an exterior, and she didn't have any power over anything. All this man did was leech off of her and eventually leave her nothing at 10 years old. This created an amazing, amazing author. And it created this new form of writing and way of thinking that has left its impression onto many generations as we still talk about Sylvia Plath and her very eclectic, unique way of writing. She writes about things that women aren't expected to write about. She's not writing about love and butterflies and happiness. She's writing about real things, feelings, and emotions that during that time were not acceptable to talk about. She was talking about things far ahead of what was acceptable of or expected of her. She wasn't writing romance novels, and she wasn't writing cryptic poems about love and lust and loss, but she was talking about very real things that affected her and many other women of the time. And it has left its impression. She's left her footprint. And this poem being what it is, it's very real. And she was able to convey these feelings of a 10-year-old girl in a 30-year-old's body because these things never left her. Otherwise, she would have never written them. Unfortunately, Sylvia Plath was clinically depressed. She was very depressed and bipolar as well, and she did wind up taking her life in her early 30s, thus perpetuating that same feeling of when she was 10 years old. She couldn't shake it. She was never good enough. She couldn't speak her mind no matter what she did, no matter what kind of footprint she's left now, 60 years after her death, 50 years. And she's been able to leap across generations and still give us a feeling that we aren't the only ones who've experienced these things. We aren't alone. And her power through writing has proved that she is timeless. There's nothing that can be done that can take away the thoughts and feelings of that 10-year-old girl and her father.